everyone. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar today. We will get started here in just a minute to let everybody into the webinar. All right. It looks like we got a good amount of people in, so we will go ahead and get started. All right. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Keena Minifield here with the Housing Alliance. So we are the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania, and we're a statewide coalition working to increase access to safe, decent, and affordable homes for all Pennsylvanians. We work to fulfill our vision for a home within reach through state and federal policy advocacy, opportunities to connect, share, and learn from your peers, events, and our annual Homes Within Reach conference. If you aren't a member, we ask that you consider joining. You can visit housingalliancepa.org/become a member to join as a member, or you can contact Steph at info@housingalliancepa.org for more information on membership. Today's webinar will run approximately 60 minutes, including questions and answers. If you want to ask the presenter a question, please use the Q&A function. The chat function is only to ask the Housing Alliance logistical questions about the webinar. Again, please use the Q&A feature for questions to the presenter. Some upcoming events. We've got Homes Within Reach. As the Commonwealth comes back strong from 2020, the Housing Alliance will be holding its 17th annual Homes Within Reach conference in Hershey, PA. It's happening December 1st through the 3rd, and we will be working to ensure all Pennsylvanians are moving on the road from surviving to thriving. The conference has moved to the Hershey Lodge in Hershey for a more spacious setting. We, along with the Hershey Lodge, will adhere to all CDC and state guidelines in effect at the time of the conference. You can register to attend the conference by visiting our website. In case you missed it, we have updated our county fact sheets on our website, which provide a brief look at the housing challenges experienced by families in each county of the Commonwealth and shows a few of the ways counties are overcoming these challenges. These county fact sheets can be used in educating others about housing challenges and solutions in your communities and for advocating for laws and policies that will make a home within reach for every Pennsylvanian. To learn more about our 2021 policy agenda, please visit our website. And now I will turn it over to Gail, who is the moderator of today's webinar. Gail?
Excuse me. Thank you, Keena. As she said, I am Gail Schwartz, the Associate Director of Policy and Strategic Initiatives here at the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania. We are so excited for today's webinar. We have long always worked to advance the solutions to help put safe, decent, affordable homes within reach of all Pennsylvanians. And I don't think any resource out there has been really more effective at that and meeting folks where they are and getting them connected to housing and keeping them stable in housing than tenant-based rental assistance subsidies. So that's looking at the Housing Choice Voucher program and tenant-based subsidies that are offered through the homelessness system. But we also know that these programs are just sorely underfunded. And in fact, only 1 in 4 households that actually qualify for housing assistance are able to access it. And that means everybody else is kind of left to fend for themselves, negotiating poverty, housing poverty, living with severe housing cost burdens where they're paying more than half of their income towards housing and having to sacrifice some of their other basic needs just to feed the rent first. So we are really, really kind of excited that we're in this very interesting time in history. While I don't think any of us would ever want a pandemic to befall on any of us, it did shine a spotlight on all of the fractures within our current housing system, and it has helped elevate housing at the national level in a way that we just haven't seen before. And so now we are currently in the midst of this budget negotiation and infrastructure negotiation happening in DC, where we are looking at, the potential for record investment, once in a generation investment into rental assistance programs, along with some development uh, or funding for development as well. Currently, in the last numbers proposed in the federal budget, we were seeing uh, 90 billion to expand rental assistance, and that could assist uh, as much as 1 million more households overall uh, across the country. And but we know that even with that additional investment, it still is far from meeting the need. But how far is it from meeting the need? And well, that question isn't just a burning question at the Housing Alliance, it's also a burning question at the Housing Initiative at Penn. And so the brilliant minds there came up with this really cool tool that can really help us measure what is the gap that we're trying to fill. It's so important that we know the problems that we're trying to solve and that we can detail them. So with that, I would like to welcome our speaker, Dr. Vincent Reyna. Dr. Reyna is an associate professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of Pennsylvania Stuart Weitzman School of Design. His research focuses on urban economics, low-income housing policy, household mobility, neighborhood change, and community and economic development. Dr. Reyna began his career as a community planning and development representative for HUD, and then was a project manager in its divisions of multifamily housing. He also worked as a senior program officer at the local Initiative Support Corporation, where he underwrote financing for affordable housing developments across the country. So this is a very long way of saying that Dr. Reyna knows his stuff, soup to nuts, about housing. So we are very lucky to have his experience with us today. And with that, I pass it over to you.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me here today. It is a real joy and privilege to be able to be here. And here we go. Let me just put this in present. Can you see? Can you see the main slide? Sometimes presentation modes on a Mac gets a little weird. Or does it also?
You're good.
Okay, cool. So I'm really excited to be here today to present this work and to engage with you all more broadly. And so I'm the faculty director of the Housing Initiative at Penn. We're a research initiative based out of the University of Pennsylvania that does a lot of housing related work in Philly, across the state of Pennsylvania, and nationally. In 2020, we helped Pennsylvania's Housing Finance Agency do a statewide housing analysis for the state that they've been using on multiple different fronts. We worked with the local Initiative Support Corporation in 2018 to help write the city of Philadelphia's first 10-year housing plan. And in the current times with the coronavirus pandemic, we've been working with municipalities across the country to help evaluate their rent relief efforts. We're evaluating the state of California's rent relief program, the city of Philadelphia. We were partnering with the city of Baltimore and Atlanta. And we've also been doing a lot of national work in conjunction with the National Income Housing Coalition and the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy to understand the programmatic side of which programs are getting dollars at the door and why and all of those kinds of things. And so today I'm here to talk to you about our work around exploring a universal housing voucher. And so my colleagues, Claudia Aiken, who's the director of the Housing Initiative at Penn, and Jen Epstein, who was a summer fellow, helped put this together. And I'm going to present our work and hopefully start what I hope is an ongoing conversation of a resource that I hope is useful for you all and what you are doing. And so, as we know, we have, as has already been said, housing is on the agenda, right? Something that we've known for a long time, which is that our housing markets in many ways were not working. There are issues of housing affordability across the housing market, but particularly affecting the lowest income renters across the country and specifically in places like Pennsylvania, in both urban and rural areas. What's interesting is, during the presidential campaign, we actually had our current president, Joe Biden, one of his proposals on the table was this idea of making the Housing Choice Voucher program universal to everyone below certain income levels, right? So it's not universal in that anyone can get it, but in a means tested way below a certain percent of area median income, making the voucher eligible. As said already, one of the most defining characteristics of the voucher program is it's the fact that there are more people eligible for it than actually receive it. Voucher waitlists are closed in many cities across the country. Right now, I'm working with the city of Los Angeles on a study for their voucher lottery, which happened in 2018. We estimated that close to 500,000 households were eligible to apply based on the income criteria. 170,000 households actually applied. 20,000 households were randomly selected through a lottery to be put on a waiting list. And now the city is going through that lottery and offering people vouchers. This isn't a new allocation of vouchers. This is just actually reusing vouchers that people are no longer using. So that shows the level of demand for the subsidy in places like Los Angeles. And what we wanted to do here is kind of more actively explain the landscape of individuals who would benefit from this policy. I would say one of the things, a couple things before I jump into this. This is part of a two-part series. First, we're exploring the demand for a universal voucher, and we're soon going to be releasing a report that's essentially a cost-benefit analysis of what this would look like, for the cost of actually providing the subsidy versus the multiple benefits that would accrue both to the households and both to the economy for actually providing that support. Again, the voucher program is not a panacea, right? But it's a really critical foundation. A lot of my research is also focused on ways that the program could be designed to work more effectively for tenants and owners. One of the things that we know and I've found in my research is that the framework with which we apply to vouchers, is often problematic, right? Not the least of which is that the demographic of actually who's using vouchers is increasingly changing. The largest group of individuals who are increasingly using the voucher program are the elderly poor, and that number is only going to grow over time. Furthermore, we know that there are things that could be done to make the subsidy work more effectively for a broad set of households. We know in my research, I found that elderly households with kids, and households where the head is Black actually face higher levels of difficulty using their voucher on the private market, because in the end of the day, this is a private market tool. And so a lot of the barriers, discrimination that households face in the housing market really often formalize in the program in and of itself. So it's not to say that the universal voucher solves all of those, right? But it's an important foundation for making sure, one, that anyone who complies can actually access it. But then beyond that, there's a lot more that can be done to make sure that people can actually use it. So what have we done here? So we've developed this report, which we developed as an interactive report. that you can access through our website, housinginitiative.org / or is that a /? I always forget which one. I think it's a / Universal Voucher. Either way, it's there in writing. You can access this report, and our goal here was really to add a lot of numbers and context that people can engage with to understand how this can play out in their communities, in their states, and across the country. We use a national set of administrative data to come up with these estimates. We do a lot of different things to try to get to a level of specificity and accuracy with these data. So one of the things we acknowledge is that right now there are some households who, by HUD's definitions, are overcrowded, meaning that there's more than one household in those housing units. By virtue of program design, they actually often limit the number of households or individuals that could live in a given unit that receive a voucher. But we also know that given a voucher, it could turn out that, if there were two households living together, they now have the ability to actually both individually find their own units. So we looked at, what these numbers would mean if we subdivided out overcrowded multifamily units right now. What we did is we applied different weights to kind of to measure things up to the overall populations of the country. We removed households in public housing because those households already receive housing assistance. It's not to say they couldn't also apply for a voucher, but what we really wanted to do is essentially capture the world of households who are eligible, who currently weren't receiving place-based assistance through public housing and the project-based Section 8 program. And the other thing we did is in this analysis, one of the things you're doing is you're looking at demand to look at income levels and who actually would qualify and maybe be able to want to access the program. But there's also a reality too that households don't actually use vouchers in perpetuity. Vouchers, the length of time that a household can actually use a voucher in theory is in perpetuity, but a lot of households use it for fewer than 10 years. And so what it means is that those vouchers essentially recycle back into the voucher population, which is what I was talking about before in the Los Angeles context. What it means for our estimates here is that, there are going to be vouchers in use and then ones re-entering the use essentially over time, which would affect essentially the number or the level of demand for the subsidy at any given point in time. And so we use kind of these broad set of parameters to really try to specify our numbers as best as possible. And so currently we know that there's about 2.3 million households using a voucher as of 2020. What we project under a universal scenario is that 10.4 million households will be eligible for a voucher if we restricted it to just households below 30% of area median income. If we said that we were going to make a voucher accessible to all households below 50% of area median income, that would increase to 17.7 million households. In 2019, there were only 1 in 5 households eligible for a voucher who actually received it and was able to use it. So I say that means that 1 out of 5 is actually able to both receive it and use it. There were some households who were offered a voucher who weren't able to use it for a broad set of reasons, some of which I mentioned earlier. So one of the things we first wanted to do was try to understand the voucher gap. And so what you can do on the website is you can go and look for state by state, right? You can actually toggle between income percent of AMI if you're looking to make it universal to people at 30% of AMI or 50% of AMI. Here I have the 50% of AMI eligibility criteria up. And what you can see is across the state of Pennsylvania, currently there are a little over 76,000 households who are currently using a voucher as of 2020. But we project during this time, there are over 674,000 households who would be eligible if you made the program eligible for every household below 50% of AMI. So what you can see here is a very significant gap in the state of Pennsylvania between the number of households who are currently using a voucher and the number of households that are eligible. And what you can see is this gap is actually higher, right, than that 1 out of 5 number. And so there's a lot of variability across state with respect to what this number is. Another thing we wanted to actually do then is dive into specific metropolitan areas and provide a more kind of detailed understanding of what these numbers look like at the MSA level. And so what you can do is you can actually zoom in and look at all the different metropolitan areas within a given state and look at what these numbers would look like. So in the Philly MSA, there are about 41,000 households who are actually using a voucher, and over 206,000 who are technically eligible if it was eligible for households up to 50% of AMI. One of the things that we also did here is that, when we look at the demand for a voucher, there's clearly a number, right? We're looking at numbers here. There's clearly proportions, which is the number available to say the number of eligible households. But there's also kind of a relative impact dynamic going on as well. So if we look at a state like California, right, which is the most populous state, you're going to see the most number of vouchers go there. Right. And they also in aggregate have the largest kind of number of need, right? But what you also want to consider is essentially how does that need sit relative to the population of that state, of that MSA? And so what we did is we essentially came up with this thing called a voucher gap weighted ratio. And what we did is we essentially weighted the number of people receiving it versus the number who would be eligible, and we weighted it by the number of renters in that given area. And so what it does is it shows essentially relative to the renter population for that area, what would be essentially the impact of a movement towards a universal voucher model. And what you can see is while places like Los Angeles would have the largest and New York would have the largest aggregate increase in number of vouchers under the universal model, when you weight it by what share of the renter population that it would actually encompass, you can see places like Orlando, Charlotte, Phoenix would actually have the largest relative impact of the movement of the movement towards this policy. And what this shows is that there are clearly kind of aggregate effects and also relative effects that are important to consider. Here we highlighted Philadelphia. These are the top 25 MSAs, which sit somewhere in the middle. The aggregate number in Philadelphia is quite high relative to the renter population. It's still relatively high, but not as high of an impact as, say, a place like Orlando. Still a significant policy, though. So one of the things we wanted to do is really kind of unpack who would use a universal voucher as well. So we said if all households below 30% of AMI, all households below 50% of AMI, who are these households? And so we found is under a universal voucher of 50% of AMI, the national eligibility would be about 6.1 million households with children, 4.8 million households with seniors, and 9.5 million households of color. We show kind of the share of the overall population that are eligible by each of these groups below. And what you can see is those numbers don't add up to 100 because a person could essentially be in more than one of these groups, right? But this is to kind of show that, this is kind of a broad set of households that are being going to be benefiting from this policy or potential policy. When we look at that in Pennsylvania, we can see that there's over 192,000 households with children, over 212,000 households with seniors, and over 260,000 households of color who would benefit from this policy. Another clear element here is that, the voucher essentially represents an income transfer, right? A form of support that can help people across a broad set of spectrums. Housing is often a household's largest expenditure. And so unsurprisingly, what we find essentially is that we look at what impact the voucher would have on lifting people out of poverty, right? And what you can do is essentially look state by state to essentially see, how many millions of households or hundreds of thousands of households in any given state would be elevated above the poverty level by virtue of adopting this policy. So a universal voucher of 50% of AMI could lift roughly 180,000 households out of poverty in the state of Pennsylvania. Close to 49,000 of these households have children. Almost 41,000 of these households are with seniors, and close to 76,000 households are households of color. This essentially represents more than a third of all impoverished households in Pennsylvania. So a movement towards a universal voucher to households below 50% of AMI would essentially move 1/3 of the households below the poverty line in the state above the poverty line, which would clearly have a broad set of benefits for those households. What's important to remember is that this is not just an urban story, right? This is a story that plays out across the whole state in every state. And so one of the things we tried to do is we tried to pull out these kind of gaps for MSAs, but then also highlight what this means for rural areas. And so in Pennsylvania, there are 111,000 rural households would be eligible for universal voucher at 50% of AMI. Nearly 40,000 rural households would be expected to use a voucher in a given year. And so one of the things that we actually did in the study is that we acknowledged that, there are those who are eligible, but reality is through research, we know that not all households will actually be able to use their voucher. Some households might not actually apply for and use the voucher, but other households face systemic barriers when trying to actually use the voucher. And so clearly adjustments can be made to the program to make the program work more effectively. But one of the things we did is that even in a very effective program, there's still not going to be 100% of people naturally using the benefit. And so we offer what it would look like under current use rates for the number of households actually using the voucher itself. Another thing that we did in this report is we layered on state local source of income protections. And so some states and some localities have a source of income protection, meaning you can't actually discriminate against households who currently receive a voucher. So if a landlord hears you have a voucher, they can't say, no, I won't accept your voucher by law, right? And so nationally, this is not a law, but different cities, counties, and states have actually adopted source of income protections. And so on the website, you can actually layer those on to see where those actually are happening. Another thing, another policy that's localized is small area fair market rent program. Essentially how you created this program where rents could be calculated at the zip code level for the voucher program instead of at the metropolitan area level. And what that does is allow for more precise rent level estimates, which then allow the voucher to kind of better match on to what the market rents are. And theoretically then allows people to access markets that, previously might have been above voucher rent limits because it was set at the median for the whole MSA. And so now that it's at the zip code, you see it kind of adjust up and down based on what those rents are in those given zip codes. And so you can actually now see on this map, which sites also are small area FMR sites according to HUD. And so there's a broad set of things on this website. I encourage you please to go and check it out. For us as researchers, we're really interested in these numbers, understanding demand, looking at the program broadly. We're involved in a lot of program evaluations. Like I said, we're working with the city of Los Angeles on evaluation of their last voucher lottery. That study involves kind of quantitative data of looking at actually who applies and who makes it through and eventually uses the voucher, to qualitative interviews with households who are applied for the voucher and many of which are still waiting on the wait list to understand who it's working for and how and where and the unfortunate trade-offs that households have to face when they're actually waiting for this form of assistance. And so for us, these data really feed into understanding the potential impact of this program, and also to understand what its potential impact can be if it be universal. But we also are hoping that you all here can use these data, interact with it to tell the story more actively, or to use it as a resource. You are already telling the story actively, but to use it as a resource as you do that to make the case for the expansion of supports in our rental market, and particularly for low-income renters within Pennsylvania and across the country. And so I'm going to stop sharing there, and I'm going to actually now go and look at some of the question and answers, and welcome Gail back as well. Gail, if you want to join me here. I don't know if you want to facilitate these or if you want me to kind of jump in, whatever works best for you.
No, absolutely. I can help facilitate these. I just think it's, just absolutely staggering to see that, more than a third of households in Pennsylvania living in poverty would be lifted out of poverty. I think that's just a staggering impact if the Housing Choice Voucher was expanded to be a universal voucher. So, I think our first question is a clarifying question. What does AMI stand for?
So that's the area median income, and essentially is the median income often for a metropolitan area, right? And so what the median is not the average number, it's actually the middle number, right? Because incomes are often skewed. What it is essentially the middle income of the whole MSA. And so that's often used as a proxy for a lot of assistance programs, essentially saying below a certain share of median income are people eligible for this program. What's particularly interesting, in a city like Philadelphia, is the area median income is quite high, right? Because this area median income actually includes the incomes of the suburbs as well, because it's set at the metropolitan area. And so therefore that median number is actually high. So what you see is in things like, say, the low-income housing tax credit program, which is targeting 60% of area median income. For some cities, that can mean one number that's a lot higher than another, right? And so for cities like Philadelphia, sometimes things like tax credit rents are still actually higher than what low-income residents within the city itself can afford, because it's set at that median income level criteria. So all to say is it's essentially the median of the incomes in that area, and often used as a threshold for determining eligibility for programs.
Great. And we have a couple of questions in sort of tying this to home ownership. Is that an area that you're looking to explore or study, or in the policy space?
Yeah, so there's actually rules within the voucher program that allows a certain share to be used to build towards homeownership programs. And so that's not all that commonly used because of the undersupply that we were talking about. But in theory, if you move to this universal voucher model, you can start exploring the ways in which the voucher can potentially be used as a tool to help people obtain homeownership. And so I would say, one of the important things to remember as we think of a universal voucher is that there's the voucher in and of itself, but there's the ways that it can be leveraged and revisioned once it's universal, and that's clearly an opportunity there.
Somebody asked, would introducing a large pool of vouchers inflate the cost of housing for everyone? Is there any concern about market impacts?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things right now is there's research that shows, or some research that suggests, some that doesn't suggest, so it's ambiguous, that that vouchers actually might increase rents in local markets, right? But that's actually often the case because of the undersupply of vouchers, where it essentially increases competition in lower cost markets because like I said before, the voucher rent is sometimes set at the area median level, which could be higher than the rents for that low-income neighborhood, right? And so what you see is that actually the fact that the voucher is not universal actually can have negative impacts on driving up rents in lower cost markets. Making it universal actually can potentially help against that. Another thing to remember, though, with this is that the voucher flows with the voucher household. And so by virtue of making it universal, what you can do is essentially have a higher likelihood that an owner can actually rent to a voucher household. And by virtue of doing that, they can actually then potentially leverage that voucher to get the loan from a bank to actually rehab their unit to meet housing quality standards. And so you can see it potentially becoming a leverage opportunity that can actually increase the housing quality of a lot of the existing stock, but actually even stimulate a supply response in some respects, right? You can actually project base a certain share of vouchers to one building, and that can actually be leveraged for private financing and other forms of financing, which can increase the supply of affordable units in a market. And you can actually also create other local programs that are more actively tied to the voucher program in and of itself that allow that supply response to actually kick in. And so, we don't really know what impact it would have on rents, right? In many ways, it's a theoretical argument right now. There are clearly a lot of other constraints in the development process that would need to be addressed, but that's true regardless. And so all to say, though, that you can argue very easily that the universalization of the voucher can actually relieve some of the negative pressures it's often putting on some of the housing markets without increasing the overall quality of a lot of the units.
And in your program evaluations, would you What have you found to be most effective in ways to increase landlord willingness to accept the vouchers?
So there's a broad set of things, right? So one, source of income protection has generally been shown to be a really helpful tool, saying you can't discriminate against people who have a voucher. That's not a perfect tool on many levels because there's clearly enforcement challenges there. There also is a reality that for owners, you have to meet housing quality standards to lease to someone with a voucher. So you might have to make repairs to the unit. You have to go through the administrative process of receiving part of your payment from HUD, right? And so there are clearly opportunities here to kind of think of small area for market rents where rents can actually be adjusted and increased in certain areas, which allow owners to essentially get the closer to market rents. A lot of places have experimented with housing navigators who have actually worked with tenants and in that process worked with owners to actually then allow for a better connection for people understanding the way the subsidy can work, where people can actually access a unit and facilitating a lot of clarity about the program. And generally, though, I think a lot of people would argue there should be a comfort level with owners being able to recoup some of their costs associated with the administrative costs of leasing to a voucher tenant. With that, like I said before, there's a lot of opportunities to kind of keep doing a lot more, which is to try to kind of pair these searches and search processes with other forms of financing tools that owners can access, right? So it's not just a question of, the unit failed housing quality standards, tenant has to go find the unit somewhere else. You can actually offer assistance to owners to help essentially rehab the unit so it does actually get up to housing quality standards. And so there's a broad set of things that currently are going on and potentially can go on. Again, none of which is a perfect solution, but a lot of which I think it pushes us to kind of think about the fact that we need a broad set of tools in conjunction with the voucher to really make the program work effectively for both tenants and landlords.
Great. Can you explain again the laws regarding no discrimination against someone with a voucher by a potential landlord and really get into, I guess, the optional nature of the program and how these programs are supposed to work?
Yeah, so the way the voucher program works, right, is someone is offered, a tenant is offered a voucher, and what they do is they go find a unit on the private market that they want to lease. Once they start pursuing the leasing of the unit, they might let the person who owns the unit know right away or through the process that a portion of their rent is going to be paid by the government through the Section 8 program. And what that does is that instigates certain forms that are needed to be filled out, an inspection that needs to happen to show that the unit meets housing quality standards before someone could officially sign the lease and move in, right? And so what that source of income protection is essentially a law that says an owner can't tell you that they will not accept the voucher. They can't reject you from that unit based just on you saying, I'm going to use a voucher to actually pay for this. Right. And so the reality is, as we know, is that there's a lot of other mechanisms through which an owner can passively do that. Right. I don't have to say I'm rejecting you for the voucher. I can say that I'm rejecting you for credit score or something else when I'm actually, no, I'm rejecting you for the voucher or things along those lines. And I'm not saying that a lot of owners are doing that, but it's all to say that, there's a lot of ambiguity in the process, and proving that you've actually been discriminated against because of your source of income is a high burden of proof. And so what HUD does, and a lot of housing advocates do locally as well, is essentially do spot checks where they essentially go in and have someone go in and say to the owner, I'm looking to lease a unit with this voucher, outright to see what kind of response that instigates versus someone, say, the same exact person or a similar person 5 minutes later going to that owner without the voucher and trying to lease the unit and not saying they have a voucher, right? So essentially different forms of tests are done in markets, but they're not done in mass, right? Because of a lot of under-resourcing around that, but also because at the end of the day, in many places, it's optional whether an owner wants to engage in the program, right? And so without these additional laws put in place at the local level, an owner has the option to say, no, I don't want to lease to you because you are paying rent through the Section 8 voucher program, and I just don't want to interact with that program.
Great. So we're getting a lot of questions about whether this program would serve one household or another, transition age youth, immigrant families. So maybe it would be helpful if we could just take a step back and maybe do an overview of the Housing Choice Voucher program, and that this would be simple expansion of an already existing program, correct?
Exactly. So, right now the program exists, but the reality is that each jurisdiction is just allocated a certain number of vouchers or a certain dollar amount towards vouchers based on population size. And this is based on numbers that were determined a long time ago with kind of slight increases or decreases, but overall no significant movement or particularly no expansion over time. And so there's an undersupply at the local level. And so what this means is that jurisdictions right now, when they get those vouchers, there's kind of set rules, which are just based on income, but there could be other rules put in place at the local level about who can be prioritized for these vouchers, right? And so, for instance, a lot of jurisdictions target vouchers, a certain share of their vouchers for households exiting the homeless system, right? Certain jurisdictions are experimenting increasingly with allocations for youth aging out of foster care, right? And so what that means is that they set a certain number aside where instead of applying through the housing authority and then going through the lottery, they'll directly allocate it towards these certain groups who often are at higher odds of becoming homeless, right? Homelessness prevention is often one of the kind of carve-outs where they create sub-allocations of those vouchers, but that's decided at the local level. But that said, if you made it universal, you don't need those carve-outs, right? Because those groups are essentially income eligible. As long as you're income eligible, anyone can apply and get it, right? That could be an immigrant group, right? That could be youth aging out of foster care, right? That could be someone exiting the homeless system. It could be someone who just got evicted and nervous about going into the homeless system, right? And so all of these kinds of things. And so it's all to say is that moving to a universal kind of allows us to really take a step back from a lot of the sub rules often applied to the program that are often applied because what you have is this limited resource, and a lot of locations are often trying to target them effectively to reduce homelessness and to serve those most in need, knowing full well though that the number of households in need exceeds the supply of support that they have.
Great. And I want to talk a little bit of kind of that connection between, the Housing Choice Voucher program and a system like the homelessness system, which also offers some deep subsidy, ongoing tenant-based assistance. And so how do you think having a universal program could help align costs and other systems that may also be trying to offer a Housing Choice Voucher like program?
Oh yeah, exactly. And that's what's interesting is that our estimates here, right? Within that, there's a lot of kind of sub programs at the local level that are often trying to create a voucher-like program, right? To serve a subset of the population or to offer a shallower subsidy even, so they can, help more people within a given population. And so what this does is it provides a really important foundation point to essentially reduce the need to create those locally funded programs that essentially try to mimic the voucher, because you can then access the voucher and use it for at the level of generosity that it offers, and then potentially be able to kind of tie on other things like supportive services. So one of the things I said before, right, is that you can actually project base a certain number of vouchers or a certain share of your voucher pool. And what that means is saying that we are going to assign 10 vouchers to this building itself, right? So it's always tied to this building itself. And what that does is it means you essentially have those 10 units as affordable now at voucher level rents that then, you can actually attract financing. You could attach wraparound services, things like that, a little more actively, because it's not, because you have this guaranteed income stream from the voucher program in and of itself. And the local resources can essentially leverage that in really important ways. So in many ways, it relieves a lot of pressure on local budgets, where a lot of localities have been trying to create these localized voucher-like programs that are often smaller scale, often a little shallower, and this can now take the place of those and allow those funds to be used towards other resources.
Excellent, excellent. So you have an estimate of the number of vouchers needed. Do you have a price tag to go with that estimate of number of vouchers needed?
We do. We have a price tag. We're in the process of doing our cost benefit analysis, which is part 2. One of the clear things is that we often focus on costs, right, which are clearly critical. But the reality is like I said, a third of people below the poverty line in Pennsylvania would be pushed above the poverty line, right? And has a broad set of positive impacts on those households and their communities and their families and their neighborhoods and their cities and the economy, right? And so it's really critical to think about those kind of broader sets of spillovers. They happen through less demand of use of local services, right? Because you didn't have to suffer housing instability because you had a subsidy that allowed you to maintain stable housing despite, income shock or a health shock or something along those lines. And so all to say is that we're in the process of, we have the cost side down. We're fully developing the benefit side because we feel like that's a really critical piece to link these things together. At the end of the day, this is an investment in households and their well-being, right? And so you really want to paint that kind of broad story together. And so hopefully, I'd say in the next month we'll have part 2 of this report, which really dives into that.
Great, great. We're getting a couple of questions that are asking about sort of landlord buy-in and what is the messaging that you would want to use or would recommend using, and thinking about how do you get landlords to want to buy into this program and accept these vouchers, especially if there's going to be so many of them in the marketplace.
Yeah, so I think there's several different things. One is just having people understand what the program is and how it works, right? And so I would argue that because of the scarcity around the resource right now, there is this kind of delicate balance of needing to have people know about the program, but also trying not to drive up demand for the program, because you don't want to create false promises about a benefit being there that's not. And I think that actually then translates into then the owner side of understanding what the program is, how it flows, all those kinds of things. I think the universalization allows for a lot of a much easier narrative about what the program is and how it works. Probably a lot more ability to push campaigns out there that explain what this resource is and how it could be used. And with that too, then also a lot more certainty about what it is, right? So I said before, one of the challenges right now is I could rent to a voucher household, right? And I could do all the things to meet housing quality standards, which might actually require me to make investments in my unit I wasn't going to make, right? And then that household leaves with the voucher, right? Because the voucher is mobile. So, or maybe they even become over income and start reducing some of the benefit, all these kinds of things. Either way, maybe they leave with the subsidy. And now I have my unit that I invested in thinking I was going to get the $800 voucher rent. My local rents for another person without the voucher maybe are $600, right? And so now I'm at a loss because of that investment I made in the unit. And so it's all to say is I think by virtue of making the voucher universal, it makes it more likely not that just someone would be renting to a voucher household, but that they'd be renting to multiple voucher households, that they would be renting to, the replacement of their current renter is another voucher household. And what that does too is it creates essentially economies of scale, right? So there's a transaction cost of me understanding HUD systems, getting all the understanding of the way the payment structure works, all that kind of stuff. If I'm doing it for one individual, I'm essentially viewing that transaction cost across that one individual. If I know that all 10 people in my actual development are going to get vouchers, then I have 10 people, right? And that's a much different scale. And so I think it's important to kind of think about the fact that there are some natural benefits that accrue. I'm not going to say that solves all the frictions in the program at all, by no means, but that make it more easy to kind of explain what the program is, how it works, for owners to achieve some economies of scale. And as I said before, for then municipalities to think really creatively about how to make the program work for owners who might be a little more reticent for actually engaging in the program. Say someone says, look, I have to do all these things to invest in my unit. I can't afford that. Well, if you know that there's going to be a voucher household in there or another one, right, then the city can say, hey, how about this loan program that we have for actually rehabbing your property or something like that, right? So there's a lot of opportunities to kind of think creatively to make it financially more appealing for owners to actually engage in the program as well.
So you've been talking a lot about, the business side of it and investments in the property and the hard unit and, all of that. Do you have any messaging to kind of do maybe some stigma busting around the tenants themselves?
Yeah, this is something where honestly, I would love to, this is where you all are better, right? Because to be honest, there's a lot of unfounded stigma around the voucher program, right? That's been disproved by research. But the reality is that even disproved by research doesn't necessarily mean it's disproved in people's minds, right? And their perceptions of the voucher program in and of itself. I think there's one clear reality, which I said before, which is that there's clear, often racist bias in the way people perceive the program and who's using it and not using it, and who benefits and who doesn't, and how people are engaging with it. And that's extremely problematic, right? Which calls for more active efforts to actually push back against that, right? But beyond that, also, like I said before, it actually, none of it by the numbers even maps onto the demographics of who's increasing. The largest growing population of using the voucher program are the elderly poor, right? And so it's not to say the elderly poor are more deserving than the working poor with 2 kids, right? Or the person who's disabled who can't work, right, with 2 kids. We don't want to pit one versus the other, but it's to say that there's a lot of opportunity to create more clarity about the program itself, how it works, who's benefiting from it, and also just to frame this in the larger context of the benefits of a right to housing, right? And so we frame the voucher program within the context of moving to opportunity, which means that its whole goal, one, is to get people to move. It's embedded in kind of these notions of economic self-sufficiency as being the goal, and also embedded in the idea that someone should only temporarily use this benefit, right? And the reality is that we often buy into that as well, because there's an undersupply. So if everyone who's currently using the voucher didn't stop using it, we can't offer more to other people who are eligible, right? So by virtue of making it universal, you open up a lot of opportunities for kind of pushing away from those narratives, for framing this within the context of housing as a human right, right? The broader set of benefits that housing accrues for individuals, that some of which are economic, some of which are not. They improve household welfare, all those kinds of things. And so I think, I don't have the answer for messaging. You all would clearly know better, but I do think this does kind of allow us to push against this idea of just viewing it as a housing subsidy to viewing it as a right to a basic essential good for our well-being that has broad implications for individuals and for our society.
I think that's a really, really important point. Thank you. And also thinking about kind of supply side challenges. Is there, adjoining or supporting policies, and how do we ensure that as new housing is being built, as new housing is being developed, that we are seeing more and more carve outs to serve lower income households or households working with vouchers?
Yeah, so I mean, again, when you have a larger supply of the vouchers, you're more able to apply them to certain contexts. So as I said before, for instance, a low-income housing tax credit development in a city like Philadelphia can often have rents that are still unaffordable to someone below the poverty line, right? And so if you're able to attach a certain number of vouchers to that development, what it does is it actually ensures that that household is not paying more than 30% of their income towards their housing unit. but it actually allows also the development to leverage the voucher rent levels to then get a higher level of debt, which reduces the pressure on the tax credits themselves. And so there's a lot more opportunity for kind of targeting the vouchers to complement other programs to make sure that they're actually producing affordable units, right? Again, the challenge here is that, as you all know well, because you live this, you work this, our housing affordability challenges are broad, right? And there's no one panacea. So we shouldn't try to sell this as the thing that unlocks everything. But it's a clear foundational tool that can be leveraged in multiple different dimensions. And on top of that, it's important to kind of think about the reality is that the counterfactual, say we, zoning and regulations around the development process to reduce building costs are critical, right? But you can't say we need that in order to, before we can have a universal voucher, right? Because in the meantime, we know we have this housing affordability crisis that low-income renters are bearing the cost of, right? And so you can have one or the other. And I think too often we're pitting these things versus each other as opposed to viewing them as complementarities. We're often viewing the timing and sequencing as a way for not doing that first thing. And I feel like this narrative particularly often gets caught in that. So it's not to say we don't need those other things, but to say that this is a critical part of those other things as well.
And on that note, I'm going to end the Q&A because I think it's a really, really good way to wrap up my last ask of our audience members. So as I said, we're in this very, very interesting moment in history with this federal budget and infrastructure package that, the bill that was voted on and approved out of the House had record investments in housing, not just rental assistance that would expand the Housing Choice Voucher program and the project-based voucher program, as well as, again, looking at some of those supply side issues with investments in the National Housing Trust Fund, as well as, repair and investments for the public housing capital funds. So with that, things are getting renegotiated right now. We don't know what's happening. We haven't even seen a new top line level. There is lots of speculation happening right now that these housing investments could not make the final cut. And I think it's up to all of us to contact our members of Congress and say, we need these investments in housing, that there is no one panacea. It doesn't have to be an either or, but in fact that we need investments in both tenant-based subsidy programs, but also in development and preservation programs as well. So I implore all of you to make those phone calls to your representatives, particularly Senator Casey and the members of the Democratic Party in our delegation, and let them hear your voice and let them know that housing matters in Pennsylvania. So on that note, I want to say thank you to Dr. Reyna for coming to our webinar today and sharing this great resource. Really excited to see what part 2 is going to show with the cost benefit analysis. And of course, thank you to all of you who joined the webinar today. This is going to be probably our last webinar until after our Homes Within Reach conference, which we have registration open. It will be in Hershey, December 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Early bird registration ends on the 5th. So thank you. We will be sending out slides and a recording of today's webinar. Have a good afternoon, everyone.